On April 7th, 1739, an English criminal was executed by hanging at the gallows in York. His crime was stealing 3 horses, a mare, her foal, and a gelding from a man named Thomas Creasy of Welton, Yorkshire. The value of these horses was £6 and 20 shillings. The criminal had, in fact, committed many other, much more heinous acts, including highway robberies, burglaries, poachings, numerous assaults, and even murder. But ultimately, he was convicted of horse theft and perished aged 33 at the end of a noose. Under normal circumstances, there would be no reason why we would be talking about this man today, or even remembering his name. But then something strange happened almost 100 years after his death. A Victorian novelist named William Harrison Ainsworth published a novel called Rockwood, which went on to become a big success. Although fictional, the story took inspiration from real-life events and characters, including a dashing, adventurous, and even romantic highwayman by the name of Dick Turpin. He became a sensation almost overnight. People fell in love with Dick Turpin, but few of them realized that they were enamored with this idealized version of him from a novel, not the real person. The most famous story about the highwayman is the legendary 200-mile ride that he made from London to York on his trusted horse Black Bess in a single night so that he could give himself an alibi for a crime that he had committed in London. But you guessed it, this marvelous feat of equestrianism came from the novel, not from real life. If it did happen, the ride may have been done by another highwayman called John Swiftnick Neverson, but for some reason, William Ainsworth decided to credit it to Dick Turpin in Rockwood. Perhaps he simply liked the name more. Regardless of his motivation, the writer transformed Dick Turpin from a common criminal destined for obscurity into the most notorious highwayman of all time, and today we'll be exploring his story, trying to separate fact from fiction. Despite being heavily associated with the English county of York, Richard Dick Turpin was actually born in Essex, in the village of Hempstead, in a place called the Bluebell Inn, which still stands to this day. The date of his birth is a bit more uncertain, but historical records show that he was baptized on September the 25th, 1705. Unsurprisingly, his early life is one big mystery. We only know that at one point he entered the butcher trade and became an apprentice before striking out on his own and possibly moving to London. He probably tried to operate within the boundaries of the law for a few years. We're not really sure how long, but back then being a butcher was a relatively quick way of associating with criminals. That's because one of the most common crimes of the day was poaching. It was such a problem that the British Parliament passed the Black Act of 1723, which was described as an act for the more effectual punishing wicked and evil disposed persons going armed in disguise and doing injuries and violences to the persons and properties of His Majesty's subjects, and for the more speedy bringing the offenders to justice. Specifically, the act was meant to target several groups of deer poachers who were active in the forests near Waltham and Windsor, but it would have applied, of course, to anybody else who fit the criteria, and it became rather notorious and controversial for the large number of crimes which were made punishable by death. It was called the Black Act because many of the poachers in Waltham had a habit of blackening their faces to disguise themselves. Dick Turpin probably did not have any dealings with these poachers, but he did associate himself with the Gregory gang, also called the Essex gang, led by Samuel Gregory. They also poached, among many other crimes, which meant that they needed butchers willing to buy their illegal meat, and Turpin was their man. We do not know when Turpin became involved with their activities, and we're also unsure of when he decided to leave the butcher trade behind and join up with the gang full-time. It was most likely sometime during the early 1730s, because there is a mention of the group, Turpin included, in an issue of the London Gazette from February 1734, offering a £50 reward for their capture, as by that point they were already wanted for robberies committed in the counties of Essex, Middlesex, Kent, and Surrey. The leader, Samuel Gregory, was described as about 5 feet 7 inches high, has a scar about 1.5 inches long in his right cheek, is fresh-coloured, wears a brown wig, and about 23 years old, is a smith or farrier by trade. 2 other members of the gang named in the article were Herbert Haynes and Thomas Rowden. Finally, Dick Turpin was described as a butcher by trade, a tall, fresh-coloured man, very much marked with the smallpox, about 26 years of age, about 5 feet 9 inches high, lived some time ago at Whitechapel, and did lately lodge somewhere about Millbank, Westminster. Wears a blue-grey coat and a light natural wig. Contrary to popular belief, the real Dick Turpin was not a lovable rogue, and neither were the people he associated with. They were extremely violent and had no qualms about threatening, beating, and torturing the victims who either fought against them or refused to surrender their valuables. By the time Turpin became an official part of the Essex gang, they'd already pretty much moved away from poaching completely and turned towards thievery. Despite his reputation as a highwayman, there were actually few highway robberies committed at this time. The Essex gang preferred to target people in their own homes because it was more likely they would find money there. They liked raiding farmhouses most of all because they were remote and quiet, and the robbers could take their time to make sure that they got everything of value. The region surrounding Epping Forest, stretching between Essex and London, was their main area of operations. During these raids, the gang often restrained and tortured their victims to get them to reveal where they hid their money. One notorious case was that of Joseph Lawrence, a 70-year-old farmer from Edgware. Turpin and other members of the gang beat up the old man and poured boiling water onto him while Samuel Gregory raped one of the maids in another room. There is one surviving contemporary account of the gang in action, published in Reed's Weekly Journal, detailing a different raid in Lawton. It said, "On Saturday night last, about 7 o'clock, 5 rogues entered the house of Widow Shelley at Loughton in Essex, having pistols, and threatened to murder the old lady if she would not tell them where her money lay, which she obstinately refusing for some time. They threatened to lay her across the fire if she did not instantly tell them, which she would not do. But her son, being in the room and threatened to be murdered, cried out he would tell them if they would not murder his mother, and did, whereupon they went upstairs and took near £100 a silver tankard and other plates and all manner of household goods. They afterwards went into the cellar and drank several bottles of ale and wine, and broiled some meat, ate the relics of a fillet of veal. While they were doing this, 2 of their gang went to Mr. Turkles, a farmer who rents one end of the widow's house, and robbed him of above £20, and then they all went off, taking 2 of the farmer's horses to carry off their luggage. The horses were found on Sunday and the following morning in Old Street, and stayed about 3 hours in the house." This account was from early February 1735, and the gang actually did not last for much longer afterwards. Later that same month, authorities captured 3 members of the group, although historical records disagree on the circumstances. What mattered was that one of the criminals, a man by the name of John Wheeler, confessed to his deeds and informed on the rest of the Essex gang in exchange for his freedom. The other 2 men, John Field and William Saunders, were both found guilty on multiple accounts of burglary and robbery and were sentenced to death. Days later, 3 more members of the gang were captured. 2 of them, Joseph Rose and Humphrey Walker, were also sentenced to death, while the third, Mary Brazier, the only woman of the group who acted as their fence, was sentenced to penal transportation to the colonies. Several other members were arrested and executed in the months that followed. This included the leader Samuel Gregory, who was found guilty of rape among other charges and sentenced to death. The Essex gang was officially over, as only 2 members were still alive, Thomas Bowden and Dick Turpin. For a while, Bowden and Turpin stuck together, and they switched their modus operandi from raiding farmhouses to the crime that made Dick Turpin famous: highway robbery. However, they eventually decided to disband later that same year, and Bowden might have been apprehended soon after for counterfeiting. Turpin's actions during the year 1736 are a big mystery, but it seems that he continued preying on travellers and at one point joined forces with another highwayman named Tom King, sometimes identified as Matthew King. According to one contemporary account written by a man named Richard Bayes, the 2 highwaymen struck a partnership after Turpin tried robbing King, mistaking him for a gentleman. This new collaboration didn't last long, because in May 1737, Tom King was shot and killed, possibly by Turpin himself. We say possibly because there is debate over who fired the fatal round. The whole reason why Richard Bayes wrote a bio on Turpin was because he was there for this event as part of a posse that went out to apprehend the highwayman, and he is the one who claimed that Turpin shot his partner by mistake. King immediately drew a pistol, which he clapped to Mr. Bayes' breast, but it luckily flashed in the pan, upon which King, struggling to get out his other, it had twisted round in his pocket and he could not. Turpin, who was waiting not far off on horseback, hearing a skirmish, came up when King cried out, "Dick, shoot him, or we are taken by God," at which instant Turpin fired his pistol and it missed Mr. Bayes and shot King in 2 places, who cried out, "Dick, you have killed me," which Turpin hearing, he rode away as hard as he could. The reason why this account is dubious is because others have later concluded that Bayes had embellished his version of events, and that he may have been the one who actually fired the lethal shot. It is possible he did it after King had already surrendered, or when he had his back turned, which is why Bayes decided to pass the blame on to the other highwaymen. While this death may or may not be attributable to Dick Turpin, there is no doubt that the next one was cold-blooded murder. After King's demise, Turpin decided to lay low for a while in his old hideaway, Epping Forest. But on May the 4th, 1737, a forest keeper named Thomas Morris chanced upon him. The latter tried to apprehend the criminal, but he was shot dead by Turpin. Once the murder was discovered, a royal proclamation was issued which offered a ransom of £200 for Turpin's capture, a proclamation that was included in William Ainsworth's introduction to Rockwood, and it said, "It having been represented to the king that Richard Turpin did on Wednesday the 4th of May last barbarously murder Thomas Morris, servant to Henry Thompson, one of the keepers of Epping Forest, and commit other notorious felonies and robberies near London, His Majesty is pleased to promise his most gracious pardon to any of his accomplices, and a reward of £200 to any person or persons that shall discover him, so as he may be apprehended and convicted." Turpin was born at Thaxted in Essex, is about 30, by trade a butcher, about 5 feet 9 inches high, brown complexion, very much marked with smallpox, his cheekbones broad, his face thinner towards the bottom, his visage short, pretty upright, and broad about the shoulders. Also notable in the proclamation is the fact that it gives Turpin's place of birth as Thaxted instead of Hampstead, like other historical records do, but this might have simply been a mistake. With a large bounty out on him, Dick Turpin decided that it would probably be a good idea to leave Epping Forest and go somewhere where he would be less recognizable, so he travelled up north to York. He posed as a respectable horse trader named John Palmer, but he did not change his ways very much. He might have toned down the violence of his crimes, foregoing robberies and burglaries in favour of horse and cattle theft. He moved around frequently between Lincolnshire and Yorkshire counties, stealing from the first and then selling his ill-gotten goods in the second. The strategy worked well for over a year and might have continued to work well were it not for Turpin's bad temper. One day in October 1738, he shot a rooster in the street in broad daylight. We're not sure why. Maybe he was angry and wanted to take his frustrations out on something, or maybe he was bored and thought it would be funny. Either way, a local man named John Robinson saw him and confronted Turpin, who then threatened to shoot him as well if he did not leave. The frightened man complied, but went and told the authorities, who arrested the man they knew as John Palmer and sent him to the Beverley House of Correction. At this point, nobody yet knew the true identity of the person they had in custody, but just by taking a closer look at his business, it became clear to authorities that John Palmer was not exactly an upstanding citizen. He tried to claim that he used to be a butcher in Lincolnshire, but fell into heavy debt, so he ran away in an attempt to start a new life in York. This story didn't hold water, though, and a quick chat with the authorities in the neighbouring county revealed that John Palmer was suspected of committing multiple thefts of livestock in the area. The case took a more serious turn at that point, as horse theft was a capital crime back then, so John Palmer was transferred to York Castle to await his trial. It looked like Dick Turpin would soon be headed for the gallows, regardless of whether or not the world was aware of his identity. However, the authorities did discover who John Palmer actually was, in what has to be considered one of the earliest documented cases of forensic graphology. In February 1739, Turpin wrote a letter to his brother-in-law, identified in historical records as Pomper Rivenall, who lived back in Essex and Hampstead and had married Turpin's sister. The letter does not survive and its contents are unknown, but it is likely that the Highwayman wanted his family to prepare some people they trusted to act as a character witness for the fictional John Palmer at his trial. Unfortunately for Turpin, there was no mailman back then. The letters arrived at the local post office and the recipients went there to pick them up and had to pay the postal charges. When Rivenall was informed of the letter, he said he didn't know who John Palmer was and he didn't correspond with anyone in York, so he refused to pay the postage. Maybe this was true, or maybe he did realize that the letter was from Turpin and he simply didn't want to get involved with his troubles. Either way, Rivenall did not take charge of the letter. Even more unfortunate for Turpin was that another person definitely did recognize who sent the letter. He was another local named James Smith, and in years past, he used to teach Turpin at school and knew his handwriting. Smith went to a magistrate named Thomas Stubbing and informed him of this fact, and the latter paid the postal charges and took possession of the letter. Reading it in its entirety, Smith became even more convinced that Dick Turpin was the man who wrote it, and he was then asked to travel to York Castle to make a positive ID of the Highwayman. He did that, and he testified on February the 23rd, 1739, in front of York authorities that the man showed to him as John Palmer was in fact Richard Turpin and no other person. This revelation changed the complexity of the trial, and there were for some time arguments in the county over whether Turpin should be tried in Yorkshire or London. In the end, his case was heard at the York Assizes, since all of his crimes carried the death penalty anyway, but he was was never charged with the murder of Thomas Morris, the forest keeper, or the numerous robberies and assaults that he had committed. 7 witnesses were called against Dick Turpin and none in his favor. His story was that he had purchased the horses from an innkeeper near Heckington called John Whitehead, but since that man could not be found, he really didn't have any evidence to defend himself. To nobody's surprise, the jury found Turpin guilty without even leaving the court, and the judge sentenced him to death. The execution was carried out about 2 weeks after the trial on April 7, 1739. A local named Thomas Kill attended both the legal proceedings and the execution, and then published a pamphlet about what he saw, so we'll let him tell us how the events unfolded. The morning before Turpin's execution, he gave £3 10 shillings amongst 5 men who were to follow the cart as mourners with hatbands and gloves, and gave gloves and hatbands to several persons more. He also left a gold ring and 2 pairs of shoes and clogs to a married woman at Brough that he was acquainted with, though he at the same time acknowledged he had a wife and child of his own. He was carried in a cart to the place of execution on Saturday the 7th of April 1739 with John Steed condemned also for horse stealing. He behaved himself with amazing assurance and bowed to the spectators as he passed. It was remarkable that as he mounted the ladder, his right leg trembled, on which he stamped it down with an air and with undaunted courage looked round about him, and after speaking near half an hour to the topsman, threw himself off the ladder and expired in about 5 minutes. Turpin's body was left to swing for half the day before being cut down and kept at a local tavern until the following morning when it was given a church burial. Afterwards, he experienced a brief revival as his remains were immediately targeted by body snatchers, the so-called resurrection men who dug up fresh corpses and sold them to medical schools for anatomy studies. But again, we'll let Kill tell the story. The grave was dug very deep, and the persons whom he appointed as mourners, as above mentioned, took all possible care to secure the body, notwithstanding which on Tuesday morning about 3 o'clock some persons were discovered to be moving off the body, which they had taken up, and the mob having got sent where it was carried to, and suspecting it was to be anatomized, went to a garden in which it was deposited, and brought away the body through the streets of the city in a sort of triumph, almost naked, being only laid on a board covered with some straw and carried on 4 men's shoulders, and buried it in the same grave, having first filled the coffin with stacked lime. Now that was the end of Dick Turpin the man, but only the beginning of Dick Turpin the legend. Thanks to people like Thomas Kill, Richard Bayes, and most of all William Ainsworth, his feats, both real and imagined, would get told and retold in pamphlets, books, penny dreadfuls, plays, and even movies, helping Dick Turpin secure his position as the king of the Highwayman. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.